In tonight's lecture, Surface Calculus, Perry will guide us through the process and purpose of his work, which reconfigures both analog and digital drawing conventions to challenge cultural imagery and our perceptions of space. We are so excited to hear Perry speak about his work. Please welcome Perry Kulper.
It's obviously an important building and an important space. I'm not sure I have anything important to say tonight, but thank you all for turning up. Thank you all for joining. I'm going to show a lot of slides, and I'm going to try to construct, not an argument, but a set of positions about the capacities of architectural representation in maybe advancing speculative or realms that lie outside of, let's say, conventional thinking about architecture. Again, thank you to everybody, the library, the city, Space City, and so on. I'd like to dedicate the talk to my dear friend Jonathan Hill, who died November 1st. Jonathan was a very, very dear friend for 31 years, a colleague, a critical person at the Bartlett School of Architecture in London. And while I was fortunate to see him 2 trips ago to London, I hadn't seen him since. So he's very, very dearly missed by all who know him. He's been a pivotal figure, a friend of mine for a long, long time. So I wanted to dedicate it to Jonathan. And the first, I'm going to show 2 small publications that include student work. And then I'll get involved in mine, which is less interesting. But this is Jonathan, the last book that he published was called The Architect as Physical Historian. And he asked me to write about and foreground student work, students that I had worked with where history was an important part of what's discussed. So I'm just going to show you a few images, the pages from that article. And again, just want to remember him and his contributions, both as a friend, husband of Isabella, a contributor to the discipline for a long, long time. So I won't go into the publication at all, other than to say that history often plays an important part in histories play an important part of the teaching that I do. And this work, this is my work. They asked me for some reason to put a few images and write about my work a little bit. And I just wanted to show one other publication, which is the book is about 2 years out now. The Architect as Physical Historian, and I'd recommend it. There's beautiful essays. And then my good friend Neil Spiller, who's the editor at AD, asked me and a dozen other educators around the world to again, foreground student work, and I'm very, very happy to do that. There are a few former Michigan students in the audience. Thank you for coming. And I'm happy to share the extraordinary work that they do at the school. So this is another, just my essay, and then the student work to do with emerging talents. There's talents around the world that are in many ways the most interesting designers in the world. So I'll reset now and get involved in my work. I'm going to show you a bunch of images of work. Some is a collaboration or collaborations with former students. And I'm going to try to build up a little bit of the status of the architectural drawing or representation as a generative possibility, opening up forms of cultural engagement that I think are maybe necessary in the early 21st century. There's some key thoughts. I'm a list character, so there are several lists in here, and I'm not sure if this is being recorded or not, but if you're interested in lists of things, I won't go through them exhaustively for sure. I'll just tickle them a little bit. And the first one just has to do with 3 key things that like to leave you with. One is architecture must be an act of generosity. Two, everyone in the room is a cultural agent, and the architect must aspire to be many architects. And lastly, education and practice must be active constructions. I'll say generally that my practice and my teaching have to do with augmenting the perspectival, the 600-year history of perspectival construction and trying to augment architectural conventions at the level of representation. That's the largest project. I'm working on a book of my work, and this is a kind of, these are the organs that are touched on in the book. From the history of ideas to epistemological models and forms of knowledge construction to key disciplinary questions, pedagogical and curricular logics, and so on. So I care, sometimes in teaching I'll touch on a number of these things, but certainly in my work and my thinking, these bullet points matter to me. I've been influenced by a lot of people, things, events, conceptual structures, and I keep, sorry, those have gotten a little bit funky, I think, are the words. No, they're okay. I keep track of influences, and they've been many, many, many over the years. And ultimately, the slides would probably look like this in terms of the numbers of influences and contributions and references that have been important to me. I'll touch on a handful of been particularly significant. One is the Baroque period, and my interest has to do with a number of things that happened during that period. The period's a difficult, let's say, epoch or body of thinking and work. One to do with developments in mathematics and the infinite. The second has to do with developments of the theater or theaters. Those are two key things in addition to the roles of painting culturally. This is a particularly important painting to me, Las Meninas by Diego Velázquez, the Spanish painter, and it has to do with my interest in rethinking the subject position, or the I, the capital I, and the I's, the station point in perspectival constructions. This opens up a kind of mobile, amongst many, many other things, a kind of mobile participant or viewer. The Surrealist and Dada's more generally, but Marcel Duchamp specifically, two key aspects to Duchamp. One, he, with his everyday objects in particular, opened up what qualified as art, and secondly, who could make art. So Duchamp's a pivotal figure for me in lots of ways and has influenced my work and teaching over the years. Libby mentioned I worked with Denise Scott Brown and Bob Venturi for 5 years. This is the second book that I read as a graduate student at Columbia. And what became important to me were his interest in the difficult whole, both and most frontally questions of ambiguity. And those have persisted in some of my thinking and work. This is a particular reference, the Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, just outside of Tucson, Arizona, and I got interested in erasure or removal as an active architectural and representational possibility. When I work properly, which was probably 2012 was the last time I did that, this is the kind of operating palette for working. Augmenting schematic design, expand the roles of representation, and avoiding the crisis of reduction, that is reducing things too quickly, and blah, 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 blah. Relational structuring is all I think about and all I really teach about. That is the type of relations, the duration or the temporal structure of relations, and then the weight or strength of relational conditions. And then all kinds of other things matter to me. The naming problem, the roles that things play, and so forth. I'll touch a few of these things as I move through the images. I care a lot about how we work. I don't think I know anyone specifically in the world who teaches about how we work. We all work in particular ways, both in school and in practices and other ways in which we participate in the cultural structure of architecture. But seldom are the terms of the ways in which we work made explicit. So I've identified, for example, 14 design methods. The grayed out ones can be talked about as techniques of representation, diagram, index, and notation. And I won't go into these at all, but this for me is Architecture 101 and is seldomly, again, talked about explicitly and developed as a part of pedagogical models in particular. Again, lists, I think about ways in which drawing or representation, visualization, imaging, this can also include 3, 4 nth degree constructs. There's some key things that I think about. Drawing is a ground to open default assumptions. It's a way to rehearse design decisions. Use the architectural drawing to explore the cultural agency of spatial realms and so on. I also have to care about drawing because I don't build anything. So I'm a bit wed to it. Mostly when I work, I try to get out of my own way. That's where design technique, design methods, and representation techniques are helpful for me. So I also keep track of things that I do with some persistence because I'm interested in making each piece of work different and situationally specific than a previous piece of work. That requires a lot, dexterity, versatility, plasticity, and an ability to shift gears quickly in terms of ideas, how they get manifest, and so on. I don't do that. I aspire to it. My work is basically all the same, I would say, but these are things, these are consistent things which occur often in bodies of work that I do. When I work on my drawing table, which I don't do very frequently, I moved into a less drawn house 16 months ago, and I've drawn for 3 hours on my drawing table. I'm involved in a lot of things, and I'm very grateful for those things, but I don't work very much now. So that's a workspace. I'll touch Photoshop. I know a little bit about Photoshop. I can answer emails, and I can download things on shared Google Drives, and I know just a little bit about Photoshop, and I'll touch on that more explicitly when I get to a body of work. And then another kind of workspace would be, let's say, social media. I like to work at different speeds. So these are all projects, and they're done very quickly. There are about 50 of them, and they occur in 7 key categories that I think about as contemporary categories: from materiality, fabrication, and production. That's a kind of body of thinking. Production, atmospheres, change and flux, and so on. So these are little word ditties. I call them language folds, and I use language folds often in work for different reasons: programmatic thinking, ideation, in this case, imaginative projects. So architecture is a fast change artist, pixelated architecture, architecture of multiple psychologies, digital mania. And then the other categories are multiple temporalities, but that's a sort of a Perry thing where things can exist in multiple time frames and in different periods of time in different geographies. Duration, and a conceptual category, 3 houses in one. Spatial ventriloquism are in that category, and then the architectural drawing. When is the time of drawing? Where is the plan? So these are things that keep my imagination alive, allow me to probe speculative dimensions of spatial realms, let's say, by working really quickly. I'll now show you some landscapes that I started making in 1992. And I made 750 of them. The idea was to make one a day, and I'd recommend one a days to everybody, whatever the one a days are. And I made one a days for 6 weeks, and I was living between Cambridge, England, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles. So it was hard for me to maintain that pace. Anyway, they're all 18 inches by 24 inches. The image part is 9 by 12, and they're driven by various prompts. So I was looking at calligraphy. The lower ones are calligraphic. The upper ones, I had cadmium red acrylic on my work table, and I said, I wonder if I could make a set of them. So sometimes they were intentional or they have ideas. Sometimes I just wonder if I could work with a material. The smallest set is 4. They're all made in sets, and the largest set is 35. And I finish a set, or did in 2005, which is the last time I made them, whenever I feel like I'm plateaued. They're really, really fun. I don't throw any of them away. They're in 2 boxes under my bed. I never look at them. Some of them have gone to auctions for various causes and so on. When I left Philadelphia in Denise and Bob's office, the only real way to leave the office was to move far away. I was deeply implicated in the work in the office. I'm half kidding, but I moved to Los Angeles, and I was going to be an architect, and I had 3 commissions. One was for a small guest house in Santa Barbara, Montecito. Another was for an international competition for a house in what was at the time West Germany. And I made 5 proposals in 5 weeks of the competition and developed this one in the last 10 days. And then there was a third project, which was a real commission for a small desert house in Southern California. Thankfully, I think, none of them got built. I'll make one point. I like to show things like this to prove that I'm kind of an architect. But the most interesting aspect of the house was I made the plan on the left 32 times. I constructed it at 1/4 inch equals a foot before I got to the final plan. That wasn't so interesting. What got interesting to me later on is I wondered if I could build all 32 houses simultaneously, because all the plans and requisite sections and elevations and so on had meaning to me. And I just wondered what would happen if we built all 32 of them in the same house. Anyway, I made this body of work, and I'd started to teach at SciArc at the time. And there were some big people around SciArc, and I was just trying to figure out what I might contribute to the school. And I realized that as a result of making these pieces of work that I had real limits, and I still do, but I had incredible limits in terms of the way I conceived work, the formal and material grammars, and the way I worked on work. Was coming out of really my excellent training at both Cal Poly and San Luis Obispo in Columbia. But I was working in conventional drawing techniques, and I realized that things I was thinking about were really, really difficult for me to work on through conventional drawings. So I developed, for the house that I just showed you, I developed then another house, which these are called aspectival probes, and they basically try to represent the critical fragments of the house. And it began to allow me to rethink not only the architectural drawing, but also the things that I believed I could work on through architectural drawing. So this was 1990. This was a pivotal time in my development. The most pivotal time was the David's Island competition. That was 1996. And it was an open ideas competition for an island in just off the coast of New York. And I used the drawing. These are the first marks that I made in the drawing, the ones that are centralized in the image. But I used the drawing to do 3 things. One, to use multiple languages of representation simultaneously, which I had never done. So words, diagrams, notations, figurative pieces, data, and so on. So that was a big thing for me. And the reason I wanted to do it is because in my earlier work, all of the lions needed to jump to the same platform at the same time to make sections or perspectives or plans or whatever. I had to know everything relatively equally. This way of working with multiple languages allowed me to work between hunches, certainties, and all places in between or on the other side of those 2 things. This was a huge, huge moment for me. So just composite thinking. The second was I used the drawing and the programmatic logics, the invention of programmatic logics to touch the content of the work. So the content had to do with maritime mythologies and panoramic and panoptic vision, which occurs relative to islands, and the military suppression which had occurred on this island. migratory and transitory things. There were a series of about 12 or 15 key areas that I wanted to touch. And I basically invented programs. For me, they were invented programs to touch that content. So for example, there are camouflagic surfaces. There's a silver shell surface. There's an axis of mutiny. There are labyrinths of emptiness. There are flooded geofluidic landscapes and so on. So the second part of it was that I was able to use the content through the drawing to invent programmatic logics that were more specific to what things I was trying to care for in the work. The third thing was I began to think about the drawing as an object in the world, not simply destined to an architectural or landscape production, but it had its own virtues and values, regardless of my intent. So these drawings are about 24, they're not about, they're 24 inches by 36 inches, and I made a technical drawing of the architectural components. There are a whole series of landscape components. I continued to open up the architectural drawing in terms of what was possible for me through another competition in 2001 for the Central California History Museum. And I made what I then became focused on was to make phase-specific drawings. That is, to work specific, whatever I was working on in the phase of the work, I would try to develop architectural representations that were specific to what I was trying to work on. So this, for example, is what I call a thematic drawing, which has to do with the primary themes of the museum, the key ideas to do with curation, to do with collections and taxonomies, to do with migratory workers who are prevalent in this part of California and so on, the history of the Greek muses. The content is supplied visually here, or worked on visually. Then there are a series of drawings which I call shuttle or bridging drawings, which try to move through phases of the work and take things along that matter, transform other things, and introduce new things as the work needs to have it. So there are a series of what I call cryptic site drawings. These are essentially genetic or chromosomal or DNA-like drawings for the project. And it's essentially a kind of a site drawing, but it's not formal or material yet. This is what I call a proto-formal drawing. And it has to do with, in this case, I was interested in the influence of the 9 Greek muses, the etymology of museums in Western culture, at least, the Greek muses, and the degrees to which they would inform a set of drawing instruments which agitate, scratch, draw on a big piece of alabaster that belongs to the project. And so this is a study of the 9 Greek muses, the influence finding their way into a kind of proto-formal articulation of the drawing instruments. Then there are things like this. There's a print, the prints of this drawing in the exhibition at the LMN space, and thank you to them as well for hosting the event tonight afterwards. This is another kind of proto-formal drawing where I'm starting to sneak up on geometry and materials and so on, but there are other things that are indeterminate or contingent or hunches that aren't yet solved, let's say. And then a former student, Sen Lu, worked with me, and we produced a very, very quick sketch model of what that museum might be like. So there's a beauty pageant for farm animals, there's a rose garden, there's a labyrinthine garden that you don't get into, there's a collection of things that never existed, and so on. I alluded to my interest in erasure as structured through things like snowstorms and the edge paintings of San Francisco and the Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, the military aircraft there. And in this case, I wondered if I could develop the art of architecture by erasing Johan Vermeer's painting, The Art of Painting. I continued the work about erasure in a project called Decommissioning Domesticity, where I was interested in essentially erasing domestic practices, thresholds, furniture, infrastructure, and so on, recoding the erased components and then invigorating the space with 2 what I called reflexive objects. And those are alluded to, the pink objects. So there are a series of drawings that explore, in this case, they're just relational drawings, and they only explore erasure and recoding. They're not plans or sections or elevations. They're nothing to do. They're not scalar. They're just, I often do this. I'll often separate things that I need to study in a piece of work before I can actually work on the work itself. These are probably 50 hours a piece. There are a lot of marks made before the surface that we see now. I also got, just point out, I got really interested in the residue, the outsides of the drawing. I was, working, cutting away, and just putting stuff on the edge of the drawing, missing the drawing sometimes. And I got really, really interested in the periphery. And that turns up, many interests now have to do with behind the scenes or underneath the hood, trying to see what undergirds things that we do that aren't frontal. At the time I was working, but I was working really, really slowly because the drawings were taking a long time and the thinking was taking a long time. So I made a project called Fast Twitch. I raced on the road bicycles and by really good slow twitch muscles, but really lousy fast twitch muscles. So I decided to develop a house and using fast twitch muscles working quickly. And I used an analogic form of thinking. That is, that things are like other things. So there are things in the project like empty game boards. There are things like petticoats. There are things like cryptic languages. So there were a whole series of likenesses that were developed. And I make, when I'm working properly, I make, this is my sketch. I've never had a sketchbook, but these are essentially sketchbooks. And there are about, for this project, there are about 50 of these pages. In the museum, there are about 120. Research, ideas, quotations, formal material things. Then I made a series of drawings. There are actually 3 proposals for the project, and I developed one of them. So I made a series of drawings. This is a composite drawing, for example, in which I'm studying section, elevation, erasure, displacement in the landscape, notations, and so on. And then again, Sen helped. We modeled very quickly. We modeled the house, and there are things like chromed shadows on the garden surfaces. This is 2004. There are milling machines that are milling the landscape. There's a pink dust garden. There's a labyrinth that you can't get into. This is a dining space. If they were conventional, the angelfish-looking pieces where you sleep. And the right-hand bit is the living space, but you don't live in it. It's filled with logs and dematerializes over 100 years. It's made of steel. And you live in 2 baskets, actually. And there are a bunch of chromed billiard ball and so forth. This is a sleeping space. There are cuckoo clock-like mechanisms that allow these 2 chambers where you sleep to move up and down. This is a stair that goes nowhere and is 3 inches wide at the top for lots of reasons. I'm not talking about the content of the work. So we made some quick images to try to study what this would be like, again, as a quick sketch. A lot of fun. The work was made very, very quickly, and in terms of the thinking, and then I spent a little bit of time working on it formally and materially. So this is looking down the face of the living space, and one of the chrome shadows on the ground you see. So I was interested in a lot of things. I started with an interest in ground, sky, and horizon, because normally I start with a bucket load of really complex things. And I said, I'll start with, how about sky, ground, and horizon? Let's just get going. And eventually I was dealing with mixed temporalities and hybrid archetypes and so on. Anyway, this is the living space looking down its face, and there's a miniature version of the proposal built on the side of that living space, and you live in the baskets. We see one here, and then there's a mechanical hawk that belongs to the miniature version. And again, I'm not touching on the content. I'm just describing what the bits are. So this is the year our daughter Ella was born, in 2005, and I've been very, very grateful to be invited to participate in a lot of things. This is the Prague International Art Biennial, and I was asked to deal with architecture as a transient phenomenon. This drawing is about that size. This is the digital underlay. This is smaller than this. It's about 15 feet long, and it's like a puzzle. It's made of about 45 pieces. And it's got drawn parts and cut paper and gold leafing and so on, the object itself. But I was asked to deal with architecture as a transient phenomena, was the program. And so I made what I called a metaspheric zoo, and it's a cross between metaphor and atmosphere. And it uses basically animal behaviors as a way to rethink an architecture of transience. And I worked on this with two former students, Mark Erickson and Johnny Leahy. Anyway, this is kind of a strategic plot, let's say. These are some details from that image. I've been interested in animals for lots of reasons in my work, and you'll see the birds will turn up and other animals will turn up. In 2009, I was able to get what we called Monica Ponce de Leon, the dean at the time at Michigan, developed research through making grants, and I got one to look at what I call a project called Spatial Blooms. And it basically tries to take landscape elements, landscape or garden types, and landscape biologies, and basically crossbreed them to find alternative temporal constructions for spatial realms. So we made a bunch of images, Justin and I did. So this is a ceiling at Il Gesù. We're blooming the ceiling. And then studies for fabric predators. They're invented programmatic elements to try to help this spatial blooming, this crossing, this hybridization of things. There are a whole series of analogic drawings, that is, likenesses of things that belong to the proposal. There are these are early studies for zipper blooms. There are real notational and indexical landscapes that belong to the proposal. And these are some of the final images that we made. In the middle one, you see there's a test tube berm. You see the real notational and indexical landscapes, the fabric predators, and so on. Javier in the audience knows my dear friend Coy Howard well. When SCI-Arc moved downtown into the train depot in 2001, Coy and I have never collaborated other than working in offices with people. But he and I basically picked up the phone one day and said, we don't know downtown. Do you want to work on some speculative projects? I said, that sounds great. We both said, that sounds great at the same time. So we developed, we ideated about 7 projects, a series of sonic monuments, a series of rooftop public conditions, a large park market over Broadway. And we eventually developed 5 speculative rooftop houses. This was 2001, 2, and into 3. And then these are poor iPhone shots of me finally in 2020 making the plans for those 5 houses. I do a lot of work that gets half finished. So I was interested in 6 what I called vertical surfaces, or let's say building envelopes. And I made a series of drawings, of which there are 2 here that study building envelopes. So all of this is a possible building envelope, and it uses my David's Island work. And then pieces of paper that I've cut, in this case with laser cutting, circles for other projects. So it appropriates my own work to try to make a vertical surface. And then I'll show you just a second one, and this is what my work table looks like when I'm working. And then this is one of the other vertical surfaces, all of it, everything, the figurative pieces that learned from medical imaging technologies, X-rays, LiDAR scanning, MRIs, and so on, as a way to propagate the work or the thinking. I mentioned augmenting the picture plane, which is, for me, it's a hugely problematic condition. Arguably, the picture plane is responsible for things like capitalism, for the development of the self being more important than the polis or the civitas. Because when the picture plane gets developed and mathematized, you don't need to go into the world any longer to participate. You can represent it on the picture plane. It's a huge break in cultural paradigms. It's a longer discussion, which we won't have tonight. But anyway, this is a project called Floor Triptych. And there's a triptych that belongs to the floor, and there's a triptych that belongs to the ceiling, and they basically discuss one another. So the picture plane is essentially out of the equation. These are just the cut paper elements. So this is what a work table looks like. When I use cut paper a fair bit, because I don't know digital things, and this is a way for me to get certain qualities and characteristics by working with paper. Again, I get invited to a lot of things. I'm humbled, grateful, incredibly honored. A friend, Gretchen Wilkins, who now is the director at Cranbrook, the architecture program, invited 30 of us from around the world to make a book project to do with documenting urbanism. And the project was called Passport. And I made 2 pages, of which this is a close-up of a page and a quarter, called Alchemic Urbanism. And I was essentially interested in harvesting surplus waste in the city. So I use word prompts, soft orange, Metro Bloom's weighting, overcoated, erased, gold, leafed. So residuals. So I use word prompts and then made the drawing using notation and indexical marks to allow me to think about this alchemic urbanism. My very, very close friend, Nat Shard, and I were fortunate to win Pamphlet Architecture 34 in 2012. And we work very, very differently, but we sometimes share interests. And one of them is to do with indeterminate or contingent architecture. And that is architecture that doesn't predict what we do, but offers a co-construction and participatory set of relationships between what we do and how we participate. So we made a body of work, 16 pages of the 80 pages in pamphlet 34 are dedicated to this particular interest. Sorry, I should also mention that my dear friend, Mark Stanley, University of Tennessee, Knoxville now, former student at Michigan, designed the book for us. And we worked with him, but he essentially designed it. So I made a series of drawings to study what we called a forensic laboratory for drawing. And these are drawings that I made, a series of drawings that I made to try to study that as a set of possibilities. And then Nat _Chard on Instagram, whose work you should know, has been making, as a part of many things that he does, a series of drawing instruments over the years that effectively look at a contingent picture plane. Anyway, we made 2 drawing instruments, largely as a way to develop our friendship, because we worked, the closest I've ever lived in that, he and Rosie were in Winnipeg and was in Ann Arbor. He's at the Bartlett now. Anyway, mostly to develop our friendship, but also to work on contingent and indeterminate interests. So effectively what happens is these 2 drawing instruments with a drawing, a dome, and a thing that interrupts the paint throw, they basically throw paint back and forth at each other. It's a lot more complex than that, but in the root structure, that's what they do. So that's my instrument. And we each have a narrative dome where there's a story being told in the dome. There's a bit that, this is Nat's world. The dome is a particular set of narrative constructions. There's a thing that interrupts the paint throw right in the middle of his drawing. And then there's a drawing, and they basically throw paint at each other. And this is what it looks like when that's happening. There are lots of other discussions that are quite rich with Nat relative to the work that we did for Pamphlet in particular. With Nat, I've been fortunate to, we offered a month-long workshop in Winnipeg, and we're offered a gallery show at the ICA Plug-in Gallery in Winnipeg, and really, really nice, very, very generous people. And mostly I'd like to show these because some of the drawing instruments and other things that Nat's made are also here. And then I was the Sir Bannister Fletcher visiting professor at the Bartlett in 18 and 19, and Bob Scheel, who was the director at the time, offered, I was involved in a lot of ways at the school, and he offered Nat and me on the entire ground floor an exhibition of our work. So this is it's simply it's another exhibition of both the work that Nat and I have done and some of the work that we've done collectively. The entrance to the Bartlett, if anybody's ever been, is just on the right-hand edge of this slide. There's some of our pamphlet work there. And then I alluded to my lack of digital skills. All the students I work with, lots of them are wizards. I'm not. So in 2018, I said, I've got to figure out something about Photoshop. So I made 150 what I called speculative house, garden, and landscape proposals. They're effectively, for me, sort of drone-ish views, but they're not probably literal. So all I was trying to do is work out, how to cut and paste what the transform tool did, and so on. So I made these normally about midnight, after I'd finished other things that I would committed to, teaching and other things in the world, as a way to learn Photoshop skills, but also to increase my formal and material range. They're about 45 minutes, hour and a half is the longest. So to increase my formal and material range, to rethink houses, gardens, and landscapes, and to allow myself to work quickly again. Again, these are super quick. I'll show you, they're 35 here. I don't throw them away. I don't make heavy judgments about them. I just work on them. And at the time, because of my involvement in lots of other things, I wasn't working. I don't work almost at all. So they were also a way for me to feel productive. And they're just 300 dpi JPEGs, and I probably made 155 of them, and I probably am interested in about a dozen. And a friend and colleague, I'll show you a couple of images in a minute, a friend and colleague, a very, very good architect and teacher, Jeff Halstead, saw some of these and said, can we do a collaboration? I'll show you a couple of those in a minute. Anyway, they're super fun. They're kind of one-a-days. I made them all at the end of 2017 and into 18. Sometimes I use my own drawings. Sometimes I find an interesting image online or a couple of them, and I just work with them. I develop my compositional skills, my eyeballs. I don't overthink them for sure, because if I go into reflective or intellectual positioning mode, then all bets are off. I'd be in a straitjacket, and I wouldn't allow myself to open things up a little bit. They're really, really fun. And again, one-a-days, I don't do them now, but I wish I did. They're incredibly helpful. Develop a lot of work quickly. You can develop areas of expertise. They're fun, and so on. So a couple of images from the work that Jeff and I did. So this is an image that I produced, and then we just made early, basically formal studies, formal material studies of, so this is me, and then this is, I work with Jeff. And then one last one. This is my image, and then essentially that. I made then a smaller body of work, but I was interested in what I call new objects or new objectives, and I still was working in Photoshop, just basically at the same time. So I made these are sort of surface objects, material-like things. Again, I made a bunch of them quickly and ultimately got interested in my lack of understanding about how you use something like the paintbrush tool. So this is the most interesting drawing of that series. And it just has to do with me trying to get certain effects in the earlier images by using the paintbrush tool, but just exposing the paintbrush tool in this case. That got quite interesting for me. Everybody's working on serious pieces of work to do with sustainability, to do with racism, to do all kinds of things. Equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I've worked on a handful of bird houses, bird motels. So I was invited by a group of Italians in 2015 to make a birdhouse to be auctioned, nonprofit, 30 architects again from around the world. So I worked with 3 former thesis students, Sam, Omar, and Mark. We developed 13 quickly. That has to do with my interest in Wallace Stevens' 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, which turns up in lots of ways in my work. Anyway, we settled on one and then made a physical milled and 3D printed object. That's essentially, called the Flights of Fancy Bird Motel. And the oval piece is about the size of a large dinner plate. So the yellow bit is a bird landing strip, and then there's a spiritual bird, the yellow bit. There are 3 artificial clouds. There are 3 false hedges. There's surveillance equipment. This is the spiritual bird. There's a bird table. There are bird diving boards, and so on. It has to do with an ongoing interest in human and non-human relationships, amongst many, many other things. They're really, really fun. And that led to, we made a series of drawings of that project to resituate it, to structure it in different places in the world, and this is one of those. And also one of the prints in the exhibition and for sale is a collaboration with my good friend Mark West. Neil Spiller, Mark West, Nada, Reed Eckhout. There are 15 of us that belong to a group called Drawing Architecture. And we meet twice a year somewhere in the world, and we spend 2 days just talking about our work with one another. If anybody can do anything like this, they're the best 2 days, other than being here with all of you. They're the best 2 days of the year, other than family things. They're totally awesome. So we just met, we were just in Dorset, been in Winnipeg, London, New York, and so on. Anyway, Mark West, whose work you should also know, Surviving Logic. Mark was having dinner with him, and he said, I'm interested in the Flights of Fancy Bird Motel. And I said, I thought of it as an ecology that it evolves over and through time. And he said, let's do a collaboration. So these are images of what that bird motel might be like over and through time. Very, very fun with Mark. Just super, a dear friend. There's a second bird motel called El Dorado, and really, really limited time. And I pay people who work with me, and I don't have very much money. Anyway, so Simone and I made a second bird motel called El Dorado, and there are a lot of these bird motels. They float. They exist in real and fictional spaces in different time frames. We used parts from the first bird motel because we simply didn't have time to do other things. But there were a series of interests that I was interested in, and Simone participated in the construction of. So there are things like a dancing bird topiary garden. There's a talisman, which is the bird table. There's a stuffed technology garden, which you see in the background. There's a sail, which is an homage to Wallace Stevens. This is the stuffed technology garden, so it's lots of aerial things that get kitted out with berries and flowers and fruits for the birds. And there's a fountain. The red piece is a fountain for them, and Bucky Fuller's Dymaxion map is referred to for lots of reasons, and there's a fireplace and so on. Then we made a series of images to tell stories. So they're composite images in which they're plan and perspectival fragments and whole views and indexical things to tell stories to discuss the narrative conditions in the proposal. And this is also a print that's over at LMN. There are lots of varieties of these bird motels. There are singles and a half, there are doubles. The horizontal surfaces change over and through time as the bird motels move through different environments. And at the lower right-hand corner, there's also a whole stem. There's a bird ballroom with dioramic wallpaper that projects distant landscapes that the birds participate with. In the bird ballroom, there are housing conditions in the stem of this piece for the birds and so on. These are simply some of the final composite images in which there are multiple views, birds becoming clouds, becoming topography, and so on. And then there's one more. There's a fourth one underway. It's called Tugboat, and there's one called Skyrider. There's several of these. They're an homage to Wallace Stevens again. Amongst other things, these bird motels 3D print Wallace Stevens poems in the sky. And there are things like an artificial weather garden, a working log, a talisman, a theater, housing in the lower part. There's a zoetropic restaurant that circulates with the bird motels. Again, I'm not going into the content. There's a lot. Just describing some of the key parts. So this is the artificial weather garden on the sort of left, and you see the housing and the working log and so on up in the upper right. These are just composite images. They're simply different views of different of the different bird motels, and then some aerial friends. And then there's one of my favorite parts is there was an homage to Lauget's primitive hut on the bird diving board, on the right of that diving board. And again, there are a bunch of types that belong to that work. Continued interest in aerial things. Nat and I started a piece of work at Orford Ness, an old military ballistics testing site in coast of England. And I made a series of drawings called analogic drawings, and they're for aerial diptych follies. So they're just likenesses, but the top part is for entertainment. The bottom part has to do with surveillance. So the diptychal part, they're follies. You can't work out what they are. These are drawings that I made of cut paper, basically. And then I was able to get some seed funding from the school, and Oliver Popovich, a former student, and I asked him if he wanted to collaborate in the work, and we were interested in relationships between images and digital modeling. So the analogic drawings, of which this is one, only serve as a vehicle by which we then begin to examine what it would mean to work between images and digital modeling, which are two key aspects in architectural debate and discourse now, particularly in education. And we got interested in everything having potential in the workspace. So we were modeling light sources. We were thinking about how RGB in relationship to CMYK color structure could impact the work, history panels, and so on. And we developed all three of them. All three of the drawings have a particular job to do. So this one has to do with a kind of theatrical stage setting, but the primary interest is to explore things to do with imaging and modeling. So every single thing here is modeled. We got interested, for example, here's another case in point where it's the same point of view. This information also has this information in it, the wireframe, and we got really interested in how the same kinds of information would allocate or reveal or discuss incredibly different aspects of the work. Those kinds of questions, sort of think tank-like questions. And if anybody has deep pockets out there, ideally, I'd like to have a think tank where there are 4 to 6 to 8 people working on curiosities surrounding representation, interns, other people in the world cycling through. We need a lot of gear. But I'd like to work on questions of representation. I think it's possible to open up ways of thinking about the world that might contribute something. Not me, but others that might get involved. Anyway, so these are images of the first one. The second drawing is this one. And this one's interested in the space of inflection. So the drawing produces a body of things outside of itself, but we're still interested in everything in the Blender workspace. So these are some of the final images. We're modeling notations and again light sources, and the Skyrider Bird Motel turns up because it was being worked on at the same time with Carl, and these are some of the, some of the final images for the image digital modeling questions in the aerial diptych folly realm. Really, really fun work. I'd like to go back to this, the kind of thinking I think there are a lot of open questions, open potential. I think that architects deal with about 4 to 6% of the possibilities of the digital realm, whether that's AI-generated things, diffusion models, modeling, scripting, coding, indexing, and so on. I think it's an area that deserves a lot of our interest and attention. So this is the third one. Again, we care about everything, and in this case, we cared about a whole series of instruments that do things in the image model production. And what I like to point out is there's a sort of cut paper. This is a digital model of my drawing, and if you watch just the cut paper, the floral piece up in the upper left, some of the interests get discussed here again in another way. Not only the instruments on the right, but that we wondered about if images have backsides, for example. So this is the backside in our world of that image, that cut paper image. And then you can see it also has a front side in terms of the kinds of questions that we were asking. So, but the instruments really were the stars here, but we were still asking questions about relationships of images to digital modeling. So these are some of the final images that we made for that work. Again, really, really fun work. Really lovely to work with a former student in this case, and in many cases, another one here, Kyle Reich. I got another a chunk of seed funding from the school. I've been interested in triptychs, Baroque domes, and still life painting, Dutch still lifes in particular. And I wondered if we could ask questions about historically important precedents. In this case, things like the Noli map, Chinese scroll painting, Baroque churches, Turkish mosques, and so on. I wondered if we could reset the table, rethink them through 3 different strategies. The first one is called niche, and that's this one. So there are, in all 3 of the strategies, the same elements: the shrines at Issei, a coin, Chinese scroll painting, Mies, and so on. Knowing that they all turn up, but they turn up in different guises. So these are Rhino. This is finally, everything's heavily modeled in Rhino. And for example, I'll just go back. So we constructed Borromini's San Carlo as a church. And then we rethought it. That's the middle piece. And angels basically construct and reconstruct it. There's a house for angels and so on. So we're just trying to use, again, we're using precedents and trying to, not postmodern, this is a different use, I think, or a different deployment of important precedents. These are some of the images from what we call niche, essentially a kind of store window proposal. There's a mirror in this proposal, and we also got then interested, so that's a proposal straight up, and then we got interested in how the mirror might behave and how representational techniques linked to mirroring might allow us to rethink those precedents. So there are there are probably 30 of these, and I'll just show you a few of them that opened the work up yet again, so that not so much pictorially now, but in terms of optical distortions and reflections, we opened another set of possibilities up for the work. There's a second strategy called knolling, and it takes, again, the same elements, introduces a few new ones. There's some animals and some gardening equipment. But this is basically to do with knolling, organizing things. There's a particular piece that's called the Borromini table, of which this is a shot, just an aerial shot of that table. It's complex. There's a lot going on, but it's effectively San Carlo. The plan is then extruded, and then there are a whole series of stagings of some of the key precedents on and around this table. It's more complex than that, but that's essentially what happens. For example, this is an Islamic mosque that is tagged and recoded as to participate in the reconstruction. And this is one of the shrines at Issei on the Borromini table. This is the dome itself, Borromini's dome. And so there are lots of things in which we're trying to use organizational structures, tagging, indexing, physical locations, and so on, to rethink these key precedents. There are angels, there are Baroque angels in the background that serve as topography, but also serve as part of the reconstruction of part of a Baroque church, and so on. There's a lot going on. Then we're studying some final images for the knolling strategy, which is the one I was just showing you. And these are some studies, final images for that proposal. And then there's a third strategy, which is called Ryoanji reconstruction. And we take the great Zen garden in Kyoto. If you haven't been, take the plane tomorrow morning to Tokyo, the Shinkansen to Kyoto, and go to the garden. Anyway, there are 6 strategies within this strategy using the same precedents. So design the garden. This is what it looked like. We're modeling the sky, and everything's modeled. And I said to Kyle, this isn't very interesting. So we said, okay, let's look at this in other ways. So we then looked at stage sets or Hollywood backlots and constructed a realm using that kind of thinking. And that's linked to conditions of erasure. That led to another strategy, which we call critical fragments, which came out of the aspectival drawings of the second desert house that I showed early on. And these are critical fragment drawings. Then we developed another strategy, which has to do with modeling Illustrator, modeling Photoshop, modeling Rhino nocturnally to see if we could disclose something else about those precedents. So these are close-up clips of parts of the garden. There's another strategy which is called construction site, and it uses one of my drawings, the bleached out drawings, and stages a kind of construction site. And these are some of the images, again, using the same precedents to try to rethink them through this particular strategy. And then there's one, this to me is the most interesting one, because this is most what the garden, I think, would be like. And it uses critical fragments in a kind of nocturnal setting to produce a set of relationships that implicate the garden without describing it. This became then, for me, a critical method as a way to redesign the garden, which hasn't been done yet. But this drawing, there are a series of drawings here, but these drawings were not only then exploring the reconstruction of the garden, but became a critical method to then say, okay, these are closer to what the garden relationally might be like. And then lastly, we used a series of representational takes on the construction site proposal to see if we could open up other questions about these precedents. So there are a couple of images from that work. I'm not too far from finished. When I work, there are a lot of things at stake, lots of things going on. So I made a series of drawings a year and a half ago that are called 2080. And what I'm trying to do is get 80% of the work, the content, let's say, the significance, to happen in 20% of the drawings. So there are a series of drawings which are made to, let's say, proto-formal drawings to see if I could not have a million things happening simultaneously. That's really a result of my early work, where I could stack layer after layer after layer after layer, and you could have 100 ideas or 1,000 ideas. There were no breaks. So this is sort of a rebuttal in trying to see if I could not be a minimalist, but do a little bit more with less. So these are also 24 by 36 inch drawings. The Drawing Architecture group was part of a symposium and exhibition in Winnipeg a year and a half ago. Nat and I made some quick images that used our work to produce a piece of work that we called witnesses. That is, things that wait for or anticipate the arrival, the indeterminate or inconclusive arrival of things. So they're simply Photoshop studies of things in our work. And these are some of the final images that we produced then for that exhibition. And then with Kyle, all right, also, this one's quiet right now, but it's a project called 6.5 Arcs. And the idea started for me about talking with Google Earth and satellite imagery rather than perspectival frontality. But it's now moved into an interest in animal husbandry. There are 6.5 arcs that move in the Midwest. The half arc is the most interesting one. This is one of the arcs being studied. But they house orphaned or lost animals. They inscribe languages in snow and in the landscape generally. They speak with satellite imagery, drones, and Google Earth, and so on. They have a kind of theatrical-like inset that entertains humans and sometimes animals. And then we made just a very, very quick model of one of the this is the back side of that arc, and this is where the animals would live. These are very, 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 very early. And then this is an image of just a provocative image for us to try to keep inscriptions in the landscape, scalar relationships, and discussing things about Google Earth and so on in play. Also with Kyle, I was interested again in precedents, like history, the cultural history of ideas and cultural history, painting in particular. So I was interested in making a piece of work where I dealt with 3 famous paintings. Again, the art of painting by Vermeer, Raphael's School of Athens on the right-hand side, and Caravaggio's Narcissus. And I had a bicycle. And during the summer, I was out on a 70-mile ride, and I had I never have this, never, ever, ever, ever have this, an incredibly clear vision of what this spatial realm would be like. So there are 3 paintings, but they're about triple to quadruple the size of the original paintings. And then there are 3 objects, animal-like objects, that interact with the paintings and vice versa. So it's not a space for human beings. Anyway, I made a series of drawings, of which these are a couple, to begin to study these painting, animal-like feedback loops, transformations. And we're just early days right now in a rhino model, trying to look at that spatial realm. So this is not for humans. Humans would never come here. I don't really know where it is. It doesn't really matter where it is. We're using critical things in the representations to begin to try to study these animal-like objects that have indexical, mathematical, and material properties simultaneously, and they have monitors. You can see one on the left-hand side. They have monitors that monitor animal behaviors in other parts of the world, map them back into the space, and that information is inscripted into these animal-like objects that then interact with the paintings, and the paintings interact with them. So these are early, these are basically first attempts at trying to get that work underway. And these are isolated now, just trying to look at a painting, in this case, Raphael's School of Athens and its relationship to this particular object. And then this is the larger ensemble. There are things in the floor that matter. There are inscriptions in the floor. There are odd instruments that might be implicated in doing things in the space, but it's unclear what they do. There's a big vat of pure paint colors that sits in this space, and so on. Eventually, the animal objects will be parts made like auto body finishes. There will be fur on parts of them. Same with the paintings. You can walk into one of the paintings, sort of, and so on. So this is early days, trying to get that work. Again, interested in history and precedents and things that have mattered to me. And I'll finish with one last piece of work. I was very, very grateful to be invited to the Chicago Architecture Biennial, and asked a former student, Eilish Finnegan, if she was interested in working on the work. It's called gifting, ghosting, and gigabytes. The gifting has to do with giving back, essentially, to Chicago. Ghosting has to do with caring for lost events, lost histories, marginalized building conditions in the city, lots of things that are lost. And gigabytes has to do with an interest in information logics, mixing AI, text prompts, image prompts, post-production, and so on. So there are a series of images that have been produced. These are the raw images. There are lots of interest to do with error rights, non-binary things, fakes, dupes, dumps, lots of things to do with derelict infrastructure, steel mills, things to do with local geographic conditions and important worlds of Chicago and so on. So see, these are some of the raw images that have been produced. This is a sort of, we have an idea about a series of kind of event conditions, and this is sort of a wedding chapel-ish piece. This is Anish Kapoor's Bean, the infamous Bean in Chicago that we get involved in a table setting, and I'll show you, we made a physical construction quickly. This is Eilish's garage and her partner, Canyon. We're just putting things together. This opened 2.5 weeks ago, so we've transported them from the panels and the table from Ann Arbor to Chicago and installed a piece, and this is what it looks like. So there's a table. The table is a form of gifting, a collectivity, a social participation, and then there are 4 painting-like panels that learn from Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, and the table learns from painted Baroque ceilings. So the panels are, they're 4x8 sheets, essentially, of MDF. They're milled, and then there are prints. There's Eilish. We're just setting up the prints, and then there are a series of 3D objects and so on that belong to the work. I've also been invited to a new AD issue called Ghost Stories, and we've just begun to make some of the final images. That piece of writing has to do with the unknown, the contingent, the latent in the world. Ghost Stories is the name of the issue. Good friend Peter Baldwin invited me to participate, and we're using the work that Eilish and I collaborated on to frame the work that will be a part of that issue, probably come out in 9 months or so. And these are the last images that I'll show you. These are just images literally just made in the last 2 days. Yeah, I've been super fortunate when I work with, people are absolute gems. The students at Michigan, again, some are in the audience here and at Sire. I'm humbled, grateful. 90% of what I know has to do with them teaching. And I'll just finish with architecture as an act of generosity, the architect needing to be many, many architects, and that practice and education must be active constructions. Lastly, I'll finish with thanking everybody for coming. I don't know if I'm going like 3 hours over. This is normal for me, and those students, former students in the audience know that. But anyway, thank you to Space City, again, to the library, to Seattle, to all of you for coming. I'm incredibly humbled to share a few things with you, so thank you all very much.
Thank you, Terry. I think we have about 10 minutes for questions.
What's the medium that you use for?
So in the early drawings, there's cut paper, but also in the old days, letter set or chart pack lettering, one letter at a time. There are drawn parts, there are animal x-rays in a David's Island drawing, for example, foil. I use a very particular Kohinoor lead holder. I have about 6 of those that have different responsibilities. I have a lot of Copenhagen ship's curves. But the mediums, they vary. They're paper clips and pieces of film and drawings. They're all kinds of things that try to both keep the drawings alive, but also try to communicate things back to me. I look at the drawings as for feedback. So there are lots of things in the drawings. All of the recent work, obviously, is digital, or most of it. Mylar is the primary. When I used to work, I would buy 25 sheets of 2 mil double frosted Mylar, and then tape, and just all kinds of rub-on things and tape and cut paper and x-rays, and they're really, really fun. They're really fun to work on. I think architecture is really, really hard. And I always say that I could live 10 lifetimes and not understand its complexities at all. So it's hard, but I wouldn't do anything else. I love teaching and I love trying to make work. I've been saying recently I haven't worked at all or very much straightforwardly on my own work. And I'd like to make one piece of work that I thought really was a proper piece of work. I don't think I have a piece of work that I would say is a really, really good piece of work. And I've been lucky to be around Sayre, Cambridge, Bartlett, Penn, Michigan, all kinds of interesting people. So I should know better. So I'm trying to find ways that I can spend time working to see if I can actually do work that, for me, work needs to be culturally durable, meaning that it needs to work at a lot of different levels. This is where Wallace Stevens comes back into play, and I try to, when I work, this isn't to do with your question, sir. I know I'm, as I often do, I've taken a right turn, but I try to make decisions at cultural levels, at disciplinary levels, at institutional levels, that is where we teach education, and then at personal and situational levels. So to make a work that's proper, it needs to touch on multiple audiences, it needs to touch on those 5 key areas, and it needs to structure what the interests are in the work, which is really, really hard to figure out how to structure an interest in panoptic and panoramic vision, for example, and how that relates to migrational logics of animals in relationship to nautical cartography and so on. It's really, really hard to work out relationally how to structure and counter with the things I'm interested in. Who can participate? How long are those things in play? What are the roles that the various components of a piece of work play? So I'm just hoping I can find some time to try to work properly. Other questions? I'm happy to take any. I'm not sure I have answers. Yes, Javier, please.
Well, first of all, thank you, Barry, for your lecture. As always, very inspirational. So I just have a question for you. What would you recommend the younger generations now, after what we've seen, and how to proceed, kind of like how to move forward with architecture, and understanding that architecture is not just the build, but it's also the creative part of it?
Thanks, Javier, for the question and your generosity. Always, Javier and I have known each other for a long time, but I've not seen him in a longer time. There are a lot of answers to that question. One is I would embed myself in the history of ideas. Architecture always participates in the history of ideas, and the history of ideas would have to do with things like developments in optics, geometry, mathematics, philosophy, religion, language systems, technology, and so on. So I'd really try to get involved in understanding the history of ideas. Then the second thing I would do particularly is I would probably look at art history And I would look at critical moments in art history and read critical accounts of important artifacts that have been produced. The third thing I would do is be incredibly attentive to how we structure our navigation in the world. Individually, it's not possible, but also collectively. So, for example, most people talk about the five senses. That's a tiny part of how we navigate the world, in my opinion. It has to do with deep memory, actionable memory, and most importantly, our imaginations. In terms of navigation, for example, I'm going to go back to the airport tomorrow. I have to imagine that I have the body motility to get there. I have to imagine that there's an airport. I have to imagine that I have the indexical and, let's say, culturally constructed properties to navigate that world according to those protocols, blah, 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 blah. So I would really pay attention to what structures things and cultural constructions, because all architects do, in my opinion, all we do is we alter relational structuring through representational and material means. That's all we do. That's phenomenally complex. I often use this example. The students have heard it. I don't have one. I use a lot of number 2 Ticonderoga pencils. So I hold it up often early in the studio or seminar, and say, what structures the possibility of this pencil? Often they look at me a bit quizzically. So what are you, a numbskull? That's a pencil in your hand. And then I'll start to talk about things like deforestation, the history of writing, mass production and advertising, the erasure as a form of censorship, the eraser as a form of censorship, and blah, 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 blah. So the third point has to do with what I talk about as relational assemblies, relational contours, relational structuring, in this case to do with cultural perception, let's say, just working out what structures things. How is it possible that I'm here talking with you? There are tons of things that make this possible. You know, you've been an audience before. I've been a speaker before. You've been in libraries before. So have I. Public discourse and events and so forth. There are tons of things that go on just to allow us to share this hour and a half. And thank you again for coming. It's that complexity that interests me and keeps me awake at night and getting up every single day to understand how things are structured. So that would be the third key thing I would probably look at. And then the fourth would be the creative arts, and I would look at film, literature, painting, sculpture in particular. And I would look really, really specifically at things that are interesting, that have cultural promise, things that are extant, things that are not, and so on. But mostly, probably just chase your deep curiosities and fascinations, and to act generously. Try to always gift the world. Gifting is becoming a care, and gifting and so on becomes an important part of, but mostly your curiosities and fascinations. It's not, for me, it's not worth doing this. If you're not fascinated, if one's not fascinated with the world as an amazingly complex, interesting place of wonder and discovery, we're in the wrong business. And then to follow one's curiosities. There are a lot more answers to that question, but those are a few key things I would think about. One a days.
I think we're running out of time, but if you have more questions, we'll be at LMN, the shop. Perry will be there, and we'll have a couple of signed prints for sale, as well as some banh mi's and drinks for sale.
Yep.
I also want to mention that we have a holiday party coming up. It's with the Seattle Department of Design, and that will be on December 7th, also at LMN, and it'll be part of the art walk. So
Can I crush that, Libby?
Definitely, yeah.
Again, thank you, Libby, and everybody at Space City, and all of you for coming tonight. I'm really, really humbled and appreciate your being here. So thank you very much.